a sword. It was larger, thicker, heavier, and cruder than any normal blade. By all accounts, it was no more than a hulking mass of iron.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of your favorite D&D podcast, DumpStat. I am the lich that will never understand you, the void who doesn't care about you, the alpha and the omega who frankly thinks you're a little weird. I am the one they call Brill often, but not always. To my, I was going to say right, but we'll say distance, is my partner in crime, the fighter Doc, who will inevitably slay me in one of these podcasts. Tune in! I'm really excited about it. Hello, Doc.
Yep, that's right.
So we are going to be talking today kind of in the same vein of what we talked about last time in world building.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to focus in a little bit more on a kind of D&D classic, and that is dungeons. Dun dun. How do you build a dungeon? How do you kind of start that process? When you are building a dungeon, what are some key aspects to keep in mind? And I find this episode very, very important to me right now because I am currently building a dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
And I have learned kind of the hard way, because I've done dungeons in the past, but this one's definitely the biggest one I've tried to attempt to do, that it's a grueling process if you're kind of blindsided by it. And
Absolutely.
It can get really elaborate when you're like, okay, well, here's my demon's throne room, here's the lavatory, here's the vomitorium, here's the library. Shit, this is big. And are the players going to go to any of these rooms?
Mm-hmm.
Doc, I know that you are the kind of person that enjoys dungeons. I believe you have built a few.
I have,
in real life, not in game.
Yeah, but we don't talk about that.
When I am starting out a dungeon, are you kind of trying to focus on, I don't think the word is function, but theme, or try what is the first kind of overall thing you want to kind of have in your head before you start making all the little details and getting into the real nitty gritty of it?
Yeah, I think it's really important in any sort of design that you have sort of an end goal in mind. Even if you're doing something open world or open-ended, you need to kind of have an idea of like, well, what should the end result be? You know, is it an experience? Is it a takeaway? Is it loot? Right. So thinking about those things as part of your dungeon and like what you want your players to experience. So like, hey, I like mind flayers. I want to put 5 of them at the end of a dungeon. That's literally what I did one time. And that actually ended up being a good experience. And that like, okay, well, how do I set up this room so that, you know, it's not just the players getting killed as soon as they walk in? How do I get there? What kind of things do I want them to encounter? And all of those things can be put into your dungeon. A dungeon can be pretty flexible to your ideas. So I think it's just really important when you start out that you think about what's the experience that I want the players to have going through this dungeon.
Right, and I think plotting out an end goal isn't necessarily a bad kind of idea. I actually kind of think that's almost just a fundamental of storytelling, is to just know where you're headed and have that kind of in mind as you go along. That way, you as an author, as a DM, aren't surprised. You're not kind of going this way and that. You can make things condense and, dare I say, tight for the foreseeable future. But you don't want, while that end goal is, I imagine, in mind, I also imagine that you don't want to just make a railroad dungeon.
Right.
You don't want it just to be like one room, here you are. And if you do that, I hope you have enough, like, we'll say, a kind of DM gentleman class to make them think they have choice.
Right.
When actuality they do not. I know that's kind of an old DM's kind of switcheroo.
There's actually a really good example of that. If you pick it up for 5e or you pick up the classic adventure, The Sunless Citadel, that is an adventure which, spoiler alert for players out there playing through this, but about halfway through, you meet some kobolds, and the kobolds are fighting these goblins on the other side of the citadel. And there is kind of an option. You can go the long way around, or you can go the short way. But the short way is currently locked down. The kobolds are fighting the goblins there. There's all sorts of defenses set up. It's really hard to get across. And so it's kind of like, well, yeah, there's kind of one way to go through here. You can force your way for there being the second way, which is straight through the goblin defenses. But, at level 2 at this point, you're probably going to die. So it's like being able to kind of have the option if it's like, well, yeah, you can try. It's kind of having the default. Well, yes, there's also this other path that's kind of the recommended way to go, is something that you can do with your dungeons.
Yeah, I think that there's an important mindset to have while you're building these things, that you are kind of in charge.
I absolutely agree,
you are in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to, like, I had this one party go into a dungeon,
Mm-hmm.
and they immediately just did not know how to tackle it, right?
Right.
And I had this very interesting inner struggle as a DM, because there's a part of me that kind of wants to go, you know what, Tomb of Horrors, I don't care about you. You couldn't figure out my special little labyrinth, so that means you're dead. But at the same time, again, you are the DM, you are the bearer of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a point where I was kind of sitting there going like, man, I read comic books and they reboot shit all the time. I'm literally in charge of this thing. I can do whatever I want right now.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be exactly how I made it or intended it to do. I don't know how much you find yourself actually in game switching rooms around or changing something to kind of fit whatever special thing a party might throw at you. I have learned that when it comes to building a dungeon, to keep it the way it is as best you can. Trust your original vision. You weren't wrong, probably. And also, that's your art, so keep it. But also, if things go really off the rails to the point where you think, well, I don't think this is going to be fun,
right,
then I think that you should be willing to not make your dungeons completely out of stone. Being willing to kind of shuffle shit.
Yeah, I have really another simple example, but I was running something last night that was kind of like a mini dungeon, 3 main rooms with 2 with small encounters, and then the last one with like a really large encounter, a boss room per se. And it was set up as 2 shadows in the first room, which could be avoided, but are activated by picking up a treasure item on the ground. A second room, which introduces the party to the Horde of Rats enemy, which has resistance to basic damage, and you have to use magic to be the most effective against it. And then the last room, which has hordes of rats as well as other enemies. And the shadow room took 2.5 hours to complete. 2 shadows against 3 PCs, because they didn't know how to fight them. Their rolls were crap, and I was rolling well, and I was lowering their strength as we went. And 2.5 hours later, we took a break, and I'm just like, I can't have them just fight this. Like, they're going to get stuck on this horde of rats, this one single horde of rats, and that's going to last another hour and a half, and they're not going to be able to get to that last room. So at that point, like, the players were kind of grumbling too, kind of like, well, we just spent a lot of time on that, and I need to be sure that I get going in 2 hours, and stuff like that. So I just was like, yoink, took out the rats, just like, okay, you can discover them in the last room, but for now you're going to walk into this room, and it's like, it's surprisingly empty. And they were like, okay, well, let's go to that last room. And that was more fun for them. They felt like that they were
good.
getting somewhere, and that was more fun for them. It was more fun for me. But I think anytime I do agree that like you should try to avoid the switcheroo with your dungeons as much as possible. Try not to swap rooms around and stuff like that. Try to keep it to design, because that's kind of part of the fun, right?
Right.
Stumbling into a room and being like, oh, there's a vampire lord in here. Probably shouldn't be in here right now. And, backing out. But then, maybe saying, well, maybe let's gain 5 levels and then come back to this. Those kind of options open up when you have a dungeon that you are inflexible with. But at the same time, like you said, like keep it fun.
Yeah.
Make the decisions that you need to.
And I think going off that point, if you're a DM for a party who's about to go into a dungeon, I know we've spoken about before a session 0, and whether in private or public, I'm not sure, but a session 0 or having a feel for what parties expect, because while you can have a party that where the endpoint is, you're willing to be spontaneous, but you really don't want to really switch it up. A good way to kind of avoid that is to basically just have a discussion with your players about what they expect. For my one campaign, I would constantly have little, I don't know if you'd call them surveys or polls about what my players thought and what they think was going to happen next, and how they enjoyed this session, what they wish I'd done different or better. And I would just keep working with them and talking to them to the point where I knew exactly what each player wanted. And as soon as I knew what each player wanted, I was like, all right, I can give them a little bit of what they want, but not enough to spoil them. I can really build some dungeons and some encounters that will test their characters, be fun for them. But that was information that I built over time. So I think that is also a good back and forth. It is very hard to build a dungeon for a one-shot when you don't know who's really playing. That's why if you do a one-shot with a dungeon, I still highly recommend being in constant contact with your players and having that back and forth. Because if you want to just throw them in a dungeon and you're not too sure who the players are actually playing, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage.
Yeah, you definitely want to be sure that when you're building a one-shot dungeon that you have a varied amount of mild experiences, I would like to call it, because you need to make sure you have the time to do it all, but also you need to make sure that you kind of hit different basic points that different type of players and different types of characters may enjoy.
Yeah. And moreover, I think that, well, let's jump to something else though. So you have your endpoint in mind. You are kind of talking to your players. You've discussed the concepts of spontaneity with yourself. You've decided to really let this set in, but you feel confident about what you're about to build. When it comes to building, do you have like functions for your dungeons? So let's say this is specifically definitely a tomb, or are you one of those DMs who are just like, this is a very generalized dungeon whose purpose was lost long ago? I know I've certainly made a few of those.
Oh yeah.
Where my players will be like, what was the purpose for this buzzsaw and these like, and keeping all these like strange monsters in cages, and it became this great mystery for them. And I'm sitting there going like, listen, this I just thought this would be cool.
Don't think about it too much.
Don't think about it so much. Please stop thinking about it. Because you're gonna make me explain it, and I know my explanation's gonna suck. So that's always been a really funny thing. So when you design a dungeon, do you look at the big bad, the final boss? Because I am a firm believer that a final boss is a good and important thing to every dungeon. I've played enough Elder Scrolls. It's a good thing, and it's what players expect. Do you start with the big bad and you're like, okay, well, Lich lives in this dungeon, so I need to base everything kind of around that concept, or what do you do?
I think even for players that are mostly there for the combat and just enjoying that aspect of the game, find it neat and kind of, I want to say like a better word than just interesting, but they find it neat and invigorating to a small degree, at least, when you have those details that are about a dungeon and there's purpose and there's drive behind why this place is the way it is. Like, and if you have to reskin things, if you have to create things up on the fly, that's fine. But kind of having a premise or an idea for the monsters that are there, the rooms that are there, the equipment that they find inside of those rooms, even the loot, if it's themed or if it's all related somehow, instead of just random magic items of varying shapes and color, then
Right.
it really becomes much more interesting. And then the players become more attached to their characters because their characters are a little bit more invested in that world and that setting and that dungeon that you've made. I've definitely, though, have just made dungeons where it's just like, yep, this is 4 rooms in a line, and you're going to go through them and try not to die on the traps, and solve that puzzle. Yep, and there's the bad guy you're supposed to kill. Which, I mean, that can be fun, but like I said, like I think you definitely, if you want to up your game, at least have kind of a core idea to it all and make everything slightly related to that core idea.
Right. And that's kind of the reason why when I'm at least making a dungeon, as goofy as this is about to sound,
Oh boy.
If it's a dungeon for mind flayers, try to look through the mind flayer lore and be like, okay, what do mind flayers do? All right. Or if it's a dragon, okay, how should I protect this horde or something like that? There has to be kind of a thought process of, you must think like the big bad, but at the same time you need to make sure it's not just like this is one thing that I always hate, is when, let's say, people are using a beholder, right? The premise is always a beholder thinks of everything, right? And I'm like, okay, if a beholder thinks of everything, you shouldn't be able to get in there. Right. It should just be like spheres of annihilation everywhere. You should die.
Right.
Like, every beholder lair should be a tomb of horror, right? But in that regard, that means that you're never going to face a beholder in D&D.
Right.
So I think there are lore concepts that hurt me. Or another thing is, you also have to balance, like, if you're using a dragon, right? I think dragon dungeons are great. I believe that's the actual name of the game. When you're kind of using a dragon, I have often seen DMs make 1 or 2 kind of decisions that I think kind of hurt people.
Yeah.
Either A, it's a big cave and you walk in and there's the horde, right? And you get to fight a dragon.
Yeah.
And you're like, that dragon basically put everything on his entrance, which, okay.
Right.
Like, very fairy tale, but maybe not what people want. Yeah. Or B, the dungeon is so elaborate, so vast in scale, that you will never actually see that worm. You will never get to him.
Yeah.
That Drake will never pop up. And I think there is that weird balancing thing, because if you are actually playing and trying to think like a dragon or a beholder or something like that, there is no reason that you would ever let adventurers ever take a swat at your gold.
Right.
So I think there is that kind of fun little, like, you gotta have to push it back 2 notches to make every big bad a little bit dumber than maybe their lore implies.
Right. That's one reason why, a certain book, something about some sort of jail of a crazy wizard or something like that, like, but there's like all of these floors and they're all just different levels of this dungeon with different themed sort of encounters, but it all has this similar or related premise that's all the way down. And that's why I find it really hard to approach, just because it's like, it is this massive dungeon. Why would I actually want to go through this? And when I try to find players that are like interested in going through something like that, it's kind of like, no, I'm
Yeah.
okay. And it's just like there's a literal time investment, right? Where I mean, certainly like any adventure is going to have a time investment, but you're going to have little mini rising action arcs, and then lowering action, and kind of different little stories that you have throughout your adventure. Whereas Dungeon of the Mad Mage is like, all right, I said it. Who cares? Where it's just like, yep, you're going to spend probably 2 years of your Dungeons and Dragons life playing a dungeon crawl.
Trying to get through this.
And it's just like, there's something about that where it's commendable. Like, that's kind of cool. But at the same time, it's like, I kind of want more experiences than that. So
with how hard it is to put a party together half the time,
yeah.
do you really want to spend that time on this?
Yeah.
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 And I think that there is kind of that with a dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the idea of building a massive, ridiculous dungeon,
Mm-hmm.
but I think here's one of the failings to it.
Yeah.
How many things can you put in a dungeon? You can really put 3 things in a dungeon.
Yeah.
You can put puzzle, trap, or monster,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
Or hazard, but it's puzzle, trap, monster.
Yeah.
And you can make those very different. There are tons of different monsters, traps, encounters, hazards. You can really mix it up,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the entire time your party's trying to get to the end of the story, they're going to go, I really want to drink that demon's blood. I really want to get there.
Yeah.
And I really am, I don't know why they're drinking blood. I made a very evil party in my mind. But it's a demon. Maybe they're good.
Yeah.
But they're just dying to get from A to B. They're just sitting there, just like, come on, I want to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one DM I was in his party, and he did this tower dungeon. And I realized after playing it that it was really 2 rooms. And I didn't want to say that it was 2 rooms, but they were long rooms.
Oh, boy.
They were big rooms.
Yeah.
They were complicated rooms.
Yeah.
And it felt like a full dungeon.
Yeah.
And I was happy for it,
Mm-hmm.
and I liked it. But you kind of sat back and you're like, that was just 2 rooms.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that with just 2 rooms. You don't need, you can fill a session up with ideas. You don't have to fill a session up with rooms.
Right.
I know there's kind of this strange pissing contest where DMs will go, how many rooms did you make your dungeon? And one guy will always go, 528. And everyone goes, wow. But really, they should be going, why?
Yeah.
Did someone go through all of those?
Yep.
Honestly, did someone? So,
Yeah.
So what that is all to say is, know your endpoint, be willing but not married to the idea of spontaneity, exception not the rule, I guess, and probably, get your aesthetics down, try to figure out a theming to it.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if you're a mega dungeon man, make sure that your party are mega dungeon people. They're a rare breed, believe it or not. I don't think there's a lot of players out there that really want to go through 80 levels of combat.
Mm-hmm.
You need to make sure that you're finding and playing with mega dungeon people if you're building a mega dungeon.
Absolutely, yeah. Because otherwise, all that work is just going to go to waste, and you might as well have just made 10 different smaller dungeons that would have worked just as well and could have been enjoyed by a lot more people.
Right. And might I just add, I know why you make big dungeons. I'm sitting the mega dungeon DM in the room. I'm sitting down with him. I'm looking him
Mhm.
in the eye. I know why you make big dungeons. It's because you want to be seen as a genius. No, 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 no. Look at me. You want to roll that map out and have everybody awed. I get it. I know it. I know you're
Mhm.
alone. I know you're watching Netflix right now, eating Cheetos, wondering about how big you're going to make your next one. Listen up.
Yep.
You're spreading good ideas thin, possibly. The players who say they love it might not.
Yeah.
They could. They
Yep.
absolutely could. I don't know these people. But I've definitely had some players go like, "Wow, that dungeon was great and huge," and you're like, "Really?" And they're like, "Yeah." So I've been in your shoes. Quality, not quantity. Work to make your theming, your loot, everything coincide and work together. Do not just make it big.
Yep.
Don't just make it big, and don't just make it deadly. I do know DMs who look at Tomb of Horrors like, well, that's the dungeon template, right? No, no, it isn't. It's really, it's really the exception, not the rule
Yeah.
again. It's really not. I mean, I like deadly traps. I think traps are way underutilized. I love puzzles. I don't think people ever use puzzles anymore in their dungeons. These are things to keep
Yeah.
and not just make it so that you run into a room, see a monster, and go, let's kill that monster. Instead, making sure that it's kind of this cohesive, trap filled, puzzled, quality dungeon with a good theme that you can run through. And make sure you time it for how many sessions you think this is going to be.
Yeah.
If it's an 8 session run, make sure all your players are down for 8 sessions.
Yeah. Because I mean, sometimes you'll have rooms that will last longer than you anticipated. You'll have rooms that run shorter than anticipated. But at the end of the day, like the length of that dungeon, if your players are going to be stuck there for a couple of sessions, make sure that they want to be stuck there and that they can be feasibly. Because I mean, I've seen plenty of campaigns just die in dungeons, not because the characters died, but just the players are just like, this is
Aren't enthusiastic.
I want to see a town. I want to see civilization again, right? I mean,
Right.
it's you got to be able to have the investment of going through a dungeon. It should be dangerous, and players and characters should want to get in and get out. And so make that feasible for them in your design.
Right. We had, oh man. Okay. I'm gonna, he knows my feelings about this, so I'm not gonna lampoon him. And I'm gonna make this as vague as possible. I had this one DM who made clearly a very elaborate dungeon,
Mm-hmm.
right? Something ridiculous. Something that was huge.
Yeah.
I believe it was the second room we got into. It was us for 3 hours trying to get out of that room.
Oh
Um,
no.
and us fully knowing that we had like 1,000 rooms after this.
Oh
And
man.
it just killed morale. I mean,
Yep.
I enjoyed it. I'm one of those people that I'll be honest, it's very hard for me not to enjoy a Dungeons and Dragons game.
Sure.
I'll happily admit that I am easily pleased. If I'm playing my character,
Yeah.
that's kind of all I need.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous to think about, but if I'm playing my character the way I want to play my character, I should be okay.
Yeah.
But I gotta tell you, man, stuck in that room looking for invisible doors and switches and just being so low level that we can't really do anything magic wise to just instantly know
Yeah.
or have an inkling to know,
Yep.
and just running around that cold room, and then someone finally running up into like it was a part of the wall. It wasn't this. It
Yeah.
wasn't something obvious like the ceiling or the floor. It was like this weird part, lower bit of the wall. I mean, to the point where we had to like start kicking every bit, and the DM wanted to know what bit we were kicking. We couldn't just go, we are kicking every bit. You had to be like, I'm kicking this bit. I'm kicking this bit. I'm kicking this bit.
Oh,
And
goodness
I
gracious.
asked my DM when we ended it, kind of as a goof, but I'm like, can we all have madness now? And he's like, what? And I'm like, I genuinely think that experience would make just about anyone go crazy. Can you please? Like, that was a lot. And then he asked us, hey, do you want to come around next week for this dungeon? And like everybody just was like, is it gonna be that? No. And he's like, well, there's gonna be more traps like that. And I'm like, then absolutely not. No,
Right, right.
absolutely not. And then he showed us the map of his dungeon, and it was like 8 levels and all this shit. And I'm sitting there going, like,
Oh,
this is your room 2? This is room 2.
oh
Like,
no.
yeah, it was
That's
basically the welcome
terrifying.
entrance. Yeah, and we were like level 3, man. It was not, we weren't ready for any of that. And after speaking with him, I realized that he built this thing for a party at a much higher level. Instead of making us higher level, he wanted us to grind through the dungeon to get to that higher level.
Oh. Well,
And
that's one
yeah,
way to play the game.
yeah, I mean, and I look at that, and by the way, I also think that his dungeon did not did not follow our rules, Doc. He did not really have an ending point. He did not really have something that was congruent
Yeah,
and kind of work together. If you had gun to my head, what was the theme of that dungeon? I would have said my
madness.
pain. Yeah, like, because he eventually told me years later what the big bad was, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I wouldn't have even picked that as the big
Right,
bad. Like, I would have never even thought that was the monster at the end of this dungeon.
right.
um so because apparently towards the end of the dungeon it got very earth elemental which
Interesting.
weird.
Yeah.
Because the top half was apparently going to be very like, I don't know, fey heavy, and then that
Okay.
turned into demon heavy. It was kind of like running through all the fucking classes a little bit. There was a dragon in
Yeah.
there somewhere. um
Huh.
so so I felt bad that he spent so much time and kind of shot himself in the foot
Hmm.
uh in that dungeon. I don't want to discourage people from making dungeons like that. I want people to be aware that when you're playing these dungeons and you see absolute contempt towards you as the DM,
Yeah.
to read the room.
Yeah. There's absolutely, you need to, when you're making anything, right? And not even in Dungeons and Dragons, like real life lessons here, but you've got, when you're making something, it's, it has to be for an audience. Now, does it have to be an audience that you know? Not necessarily, but you have to have an intent in mind. And if you do have a focus group that you're making something for, you have to make it for them, because if you don't, then you're going to have issues with people really enjoying it, just getting any value out of that. But it sounds like in your dungeon, like, to me, like, I think I'm hearing that story and I'm thinking like, well, it'd be kind of cool to like try it. Like, it'd be cool to see if I can get, one of my buddies with his paladin, in on this, and a wizard, and then do, like a fighter for protection, and, just another guy, like a rogue, to pick open doors and stuff, and like try to get through this. But, that's me kind of like knowing ahead of time what's up. And I think that's another crucial part, is that
Right.
the DM has to give you, and you have to give your
Expectation.
players a heads up and say like,
Right.
hey, this is the dungeon. There's lots of puzzles. There's lots of tricky puzzles. There's magic things. Like, you need to be prepared for that if you're going in. And if you're not prepared, don't go in, because
Right.
you will die, or you will get
It just
madness.
will not be fun.
Yeah.
And here's a little piece of advice. DMs, Tomb of Horrors is great. It's one of those things you always warn about.
Yep.
And I know there's that one guy who's like, I don't warn my players about anything. I just kill them. I'm that TPK guy. And I'm kind of sitting there going like, that's boring. Don't be that guy.
Yep. But even then, like at that point, your players are probably accustomed to knowing that like you're that guy who will spring a really big trap and try to TPK your players and stuff. I mean, if that works for your table, but
Yeah.
if you're a new DM and you're thinking, oh, it'll be fun to, try to
Murder.
TPK my players without warning is not a good idea, or without some foreboding.
Right.
Oh
And
yeah.
let me just say this, especially the new DMs, killing a player is not as fun that first time as you like to think.
Oof.
It is a lot.
True.
Listen, I ran for a long time a little D&D concept that I still do from time to time. That's premises you will die in this.
Mm-hmm.
That was the premise. And I got to tell you, man, those first few, before you get callous and creepy about it, but those first couple of deaths, the players get so distraught if it's a character they love. And you originally think that you're going to like bathe in it and enjoy it and be that sadistic evil, lich that I am.
Mm-hmm.
But you realize that if you kill a player, you have to give something back. You need to give them something. You need to give them an epic exit, a cool final stop. To just say you're dead now is a very hard thing to do for a player who's very attached to that character. I get that Game of Thrones is popular. Lord of the Rings it more. Just being honest. People like to be heroes. People want to build bonds. This is a form of escapism. Just murdering people is kind of silly unless you again warn your players like I did and say, hey, this is going to kill you.
Well, and like to relate it to dungeons and stuff, looking at the Mines of Moria and then Gandalf holding off the Balrog, right? Like
I was about to slap you silly if you got that wrong.
and like if you're thinking of this as a D&D adventuring party, right? They knew the risks, right? There's omens and stories and kind of things. They walked in the front door and there's dead people everywhere, and there's all these omens that say, hey, this place is for real, get ready. And they do fairly well, but then they get to that Balrog, and if you're a DM running that campaign and you had your player who does the epic moment of holding off the Balrog and then he dies in that fight, quote unquote dies, like that, having something that you designed and made take out a character, like at least give them a good going out. And also like be able to talk with your player, because it does, as long as you're not like super sadistic or narcissistic, it can be a little bit of a weight on everybody and on that player. Like, oh man, like his character just died. What do we do now? Like, well, you keep playing, you make a new character, but like that sucks. Like it does. You have to be mindful of that when you're making your dungeon, that like if you're designing it to kill people, you need to be ready for what happens for when it kills people. And if you design something to be a mundane, stupid death, like falling 100 feet into a spiky pit poison trap of, terrible, sphere of annihilation death, you're going to have to realize that that's a pretty mundane and awful way to go. And that's going to sit in your player's mouth a little bit too.
Yeah, basic.
Yeah.
Yeah, basic. Anybody can use a sphere of annihilation to kill somebody, but can somebody get killed by a kobold pregnancy? Think outside the box, everybody.
Well, let's put it about like in my example, like where it almost killed a player with the Mind Flayer showdown that I had mentioned earlier, where you had 5 different Mind Flayers casting
You
spells at the
feeble-minded
players.
someone. I
I
remember that.
feeble-minded someone, which was amazing. That was freaking the probably one of my best D&D memories. Just like, I don't really know what this spell does, and casting it and it working, and then I read the description and I was like, oh, this is amazing. But for those of you who don't know, feeble minds
Oh,
basically just makes your intelligence drop down to 2. So like you understand language but you can't speak, and you become kind of a babbling, lubber. But
works great for mind flayers.
it's amazing. But the in that situation, like one of the players was kind of dealing with this moment of, do I stick around and try to distract the mind flayers to focus their attacks on me to let everyone else get away? And that's a cool moment for a player to weigh, where it's like, do I play this game in the way that's strategic and the wargaming game, or do I play this in the role playing, I'll hold them off because it's the right thing to do sort of way? And giving the player that moment is a really cool thing that you can kind of put into your design of, this might happen, and I want the situation to allow that to happen. Or if you set up a trap that is really deadly, make it so that like there's at least some signs, at least at lower levels, that if they do set off the trap and it does kill them, they're probably pretty stupid for having done so. Like, yeah,
Sure.
you didn't notice the 2 other bodies that had been roasted alive in front of this gaping mouth in the hole in the wall. Well, yeah, you should have taken that sign as, something really bad happened there.
Right. I think, getting towards kind of final thoughts, I think, again, knowing your endpoint, theming, not being, too overblown, kind of quality, not quantity.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to say it, traps, my guys. Traps and puzzles are things too.
Yeah.
I think that these are elements of a dungeon that people do not use enough.
Yeah.
You have to have that kind of beginning of Indiana Jones kind of mindset,
Yeah.
in the sense of, he's literally running through a small dungeon full of traps.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's such a great, I don't know, thing is because they're hidden, they're subtle, and they do quite a bit of damage. I believe it kills his partner in the movie. Spoiler alert for like a 50-year-old film. And not partner, his partner betrays him. That's right. By the
Yeah,
way, it's
that's
all
right.
on Netflix. Go watch Indiana Jones, everybody. You're missing out.
Yeah. Great
But
movie.
great movies. Ugh. But I think that there is this kind of issue there where you need to use traps. I think that it's in your arsenal as a DM,
Mhm.
and you'll be surprised with what you come up with. I think there's a fear of using traps because it's not as simplified as just using an encounter. An
Yeah.
encounter is, you drop a monster in, it's kind of plug and play,
Yep.
and you can maybe make the terrain more based to that monster. But a
Mhm.
trap has more thought into it, but you'll be rewarded when those things work, man,
Yeah.
or when they don't work, and you have a player go, "Hey, there's a trap here. That would
Yeah.
have really messed us up, guys. I
Yep.
bet there's more. Let's be cautious."
And there's, if you want to find out more about traps, look up DM's Guild if you want to pay for something, but feel no fear of going on to Reddit and searching Unearthed Arcana or D&D or one of those subreddits. Just Google something. But also, like, when you're creating something, I've seen some really ingenious puzzles that, if you really want to get creative about refracting light, about physics, and then at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with, you step on the stone tile that is slightly higher than the rest and it sinks down and arrows fly out from the walls and stuff. Like that sort of thing, can be kind of like a adult kind of moment for the characters, but like they're still fun. They don't
Right.
have to be super elaborate. That sort of thing is, and it's a fun way to keep your players on edge too in your dungeons.
Oh, and do yourself a favor, write stuff down.
Oh
Always
yeah.
write stuff down. I was talking to my one DM friend who he came up to me and he was just like, I have a great gravity puzzle. And I'm like, awesome, let's hear it. And he breaks down this very complicated button system for gravity, and I'm sitting there going like, this will be great in a dungeon, you
Yeah.
know? And I'm like, where are you gonna put that? And he's like, I have no idea. I was just in the
No.
shower and I just came up with it. And I'm like, that's great. And he goes, I have no idea where this is going to happen again. And it wasn't, I think, till like, I want to say 2 years later, 2.5
Mhm.
years later, I'm on the phone with him and he just goes, hey, I finally used it. And I was like, was it great? He goes, absolutely.
That's awesome.
And I was kind of sitting there going like, write shit down.
Yep.
I don't know about you, but if I'm thinking about D&D stuff in the shower, that's the perfect place. The dungeon that I'm building right now is a follow-up to a session prior, and it's a very plane of fire based dungeon.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to make it a little bit more elaborate or interesting with a lot more kind of gin and a lot more aesthetic towards kind of the Middle East about it.
Interesting.
Or along with some more, I don't want to just use elementals everywhere. I know fire with faces is great, but salamanders and using different forms of fire, I guess, themed
Yeah.
characters, and trying to make it not just the Fire Nation from Avatar: The Last Airbender. All of that
Right.
has been a
You
lot
do
of
like
fun.
armored bugs and stuff like that, like,
Oh
dung
yeah,
beetles that are, like wielding spears and super armored and slaying, crap everywhere. That'd be interesting.
well, one of the things that I made was I actually really it's a kind of weird lamp statue, kind of lamp statue
Interesting.
golem who has
Lamp.
a lamp. Who his whole point is he opens his mouth and he blinds you for a second, and then he gets advantage on hurting you. I made
Yeah.
him. I was very proud of him. Aesthetically, he looks great. And I also, as silly as it is, I think while I'm still not completely married to it, I
Mhm.
think making the big bad literally a fire breathing dragon or something akin to that might not be a bad idea. I've also considered making the big bad more of a Jin slaver, fire Jin
Yeah.
slaver kind of deal. But I think I'm leaning dragon, and the reason why I'm making it so fire heavy is my players are going towards a Mustafar location. so
Okay.
so I'm trying to kind of Mustafar is the fire lava planet for all you people who aren't Star Wars out there. I understand that the sci-fi fantasy divide is quite wide to some people, but I'm trying to build a fire related dungeon, but not just making it, here's another fire elemental,
Right.
here's a fire with a face, here's Ignis, the fire elemental. Like
Right.
I really want it to be, and here's fire cultists. What do? They worship fire. I want it to be weird and hot and kind of strange, and maybe taking from cultures that my players might not necessarily had seen before. And also riddles, man. I'm making it full of riddles. I don't know why it's so riddle heavy, but I really like it. I've got 3. I'm really happy. And by the way,
Yeah.
3 is riddled heavy. Um, 3 riddles, not in a row, but throughout a dungeon, people are like, "Oh my god."
Right.
um, okay, homeboy likes riddles. So that is kind of something that I've been working in my spare time along, DMing other things and building up other things. But it's definitely been a lot of fun, and
Yeah.
using, just looking through the monster manual and different kind of looking even through different editions and being like, okay, what are, fire dwarves, fire giants? What do we got that is fire?
Right.
What is fire related?
Yeah.
And then trying to see where I can be clever about it, and theme it right. I should have made the end goal first, to work more with you, and but I think it's kind of coming together. I immediately
Yeah.
broke our first rule. God damn it, Mike.
Well,
Ah!
and there's something to that where like it, as long as like I think you're wanting to take your player somewhere, right? Getting to a Mustafar location. And I think that's technically your end goal. Well, there's not like you didn't have a big bad in mind, right? They're going to have to get through something to get to
Right.
that end location. So I'd say that you still had an end goal in mind. It's just not a traditional big bad end goal.
Yeah,
But
I'm still gonna have a big bad.
yeah, absolutely.
Because I mean, it's fundamental to like the human DNA to have a villain to fight, having a big bad to take down. I think that it's important to always have your antagonist in mind and to make an antagonist.
Yeah,
And I know some people are like, oh, well, not everything needs to have a villain. And I'm like, not everything, but villains do definitely help,
yeah,
especially when you have, the party full of heroes or misfits or edgelords or villains who
yeah.
are coming here to fight the bigger villain or something along those lines.
hmm
Kind of a final question, Doc.
Yeah.
What monster do you find yourself using all the time in dungeons? What is your favorite
Oh.
little thing to throw in there? Even if it might not make sense.
That is a good question. I'm unafraid to use low CR monsters just because they jump out, they surprise you with an attack, they get 2 or 3 damage in, which isn't much for a level 5 party, but over time, now they're down to half their health and now they're questioning, what they need to do for short rests and whatnot. But my favorite low CR monster has to be the Shadow, which is an undead, basically like literally what the name implies, a shadow. My favorite property of them is that when they hit with an attack, no save, you roll d4 and that number is subtracted from their strength score
Right.
until they take a short or long rest.
So
And
3 or 4 of those things can really mess up a
young,
party,
if you
or at
have
least a player.
Yeah. If you had 3 attack one person all at the same time, and you get lucky with your dice rolls and you're landing, 3s, let's say, or an average of 3, you just reduced a person's strength score by at least half, and they're almost at the brink of death at that point. If you hit someone with heavy armor like that, then you've basically made it so that they shouldn't be able to wear their armor and they're not going to be able to move. There's a lot of cool implications that you can put there, and it's intimidating when you say, oh yeah, and you just lose 3 points of your strength score, and that player gets wide eyes and starts sweating, and they're like, oh no, what do? I swing in and I attack. Yeah, it's resistant to your damage. Oh no. And just like the continual process of that.
I swear by it now.
Mm-hmm.
I, for one of my campaigns, killed somebody with a gelatinous cube.
Oh yes,
And
classic.
I think I lost my DM virginity. It was awesome. And they weren't that low level. It was very interesting to see how it worked.
I almost walked into a gelatinous cube as a player, and I mean, it was like, oh yeah, you look into this room and there's just objects floating in the room. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. And I was about to say that I walked into the room when another player interrupted and said, can I push my walking stick into the room? And they said, it feels like you hit a massive amount of resistance, but you're able to push that walking stick in. And then they're like, I pull it out. And they said, you pull it out and the walking stick is slimy. And I was like, oh no, I almost killed myself.
I had a player turn the corner into one. Very happy. I'm a very happy DM. And it was great just because how the players interacted with it, because I didn't just have a
Yeah.
gelatinous cube. I had other things ambush them from either side while their friend is in the gelatinous cube, who for
Mhm.
some reason just could not make the save to get out.
Yeah.
So after they handle kind of the ambush, he's slowly disintegrating, and they're
Yeah.
like begging the universe to save him, digging at the slime, just hacking at it,
Right.
just like wailing in tears, and they're like, "You can make it, buddy!" And he's like doing his final rites through like telepathy, like to
Right.
his like one best friend, and I'm sitting there going
Oh,
like,
man.
yes,
Yes.
yes. And at the end of it, they kill it, and I'm looking at this thing, and I was like, God damn, I get why it's a classic.
Yeah.
I've never used this before. This is great. Why
Yep.
haven't I used this for every dungeon?
Right.
And I'm on that slime bandwagon. I think
Mhm.
slimes are just a great thing to throw in
Yeah.
dungeons, man. They work.
And they're great for when you have players that like to just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to move my character wherever I want. And it's like, I put them here. And I'm like, oh yeah, you get stuck here. And you start floating. And they're like, what? And then you're like,
What?
you start taking damage. And they're like, I yell for help. And I'm like, you get drowned by slime. And, you know, and it's just like, you know, the other players are just off investigating this room. Like, oh, what's under this chair? Meanwhile, their other friend is, you know, disintegrating. Yeah, they're a great monster. Definitely use them all the time, every time.
Yeah. All right, Doc, you had one thing you wanted to give out, a little piece of information for the masses. What was that, bud?
So if you are a new DM or an experienced DM and you're looking for something that's going to be a good introduction for a dungeon that will probably only last you 1 or 2 sessions of playtime and is system agnostic, I really highly recommend that you look up Oath of the Frozen King. And that is a supplement created by a group called Absolute Tabletop. It's built kind of for 5e, but it is, again, system agnostic. It's less than $20 for the PDF itself. You can get a download of it. The cool thing is that you roll a fistful of dice, and using this roll method, you create a customized dungeon with an end boss, with some loot, you know, with some cool rooms, with traps and environmental hazards and different enemies inside. It's really worth it if you want to make something really quickly that's going to be fun every single time, and is kind of a good example of how a dungeon should play out and should work. So really a good supplement. Definitely go out and check it out. If you want to get your hands into building a dungeon, but you're not sure where to start, it's going to hold your hands through it, but it's going to be really fun for your players.
All right. Wonderful. All right. Check out Horizon Kingdoms RPG over on Facebook and Twitter. Yep. Doc, thank you very much for coming in here, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yep. See ya.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
You've just been listening to DumpStat, a podcast presented by Horizon Kingdoms. Horizon Kingdoms is a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition server that's free to play. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and join up on Discord to join in on a new adventure. For more DumpStat, be sure to find us on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe.